Hi, everyone. I wanted to give you a content warning for this episode. There's a little bit that talks about violence to Indigenous peoples. So I just wanted to make sure I let you know before you listen. Thank you so very much. Thank you so much for being here. This is Ashwini Prasad, your host of the Inclusive Storytelling Podcast. If you're liking these episodes, please leave a review, download, comment if you're on YouTube, and share these episodes. Feel free to connect with me at theinclusivescreenwriter.com or on Twitter and Instagram at The Inclusive Screenwriter. In addition to being an anti-racism and anti-oppression educator, I'm a screenwriter, self-published author, and of course a podcast host. So if I can make our media more inclusive with you, feel free to reach out. All right, let's jump into our episode. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Inclusive Storytelling Podcast. Today, I have Randall Jahnson. Randall, welcome. How are you?
I am well, Ashwini. I'm very glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. Well, really quickly, Randall was my screenwriter teacher for 2 semesters, so this is great to have you. I appreciate you. Randall, why don't you go ahead and let everybody know who you are? Because you're as fascinating as the person you're going to talk about.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I hope I can live up to that. Well, Ashwini, gosh, I've been a screenwriter professionally since 1985. So I was started way back in the mid 80s when, it was an entirely different business. Broke in with a movie called Dudes that was directed by Penelope Spheris. It was a punk rock Western, for lack of a better term. And then that led to further work for me, including The Doors, that I share credit with on the screenplay with Oliver Stone. Then on to part of what we'll talk about today is The Mask of Zorro, and a host of other stuff. And I've messed around with video games. I've now everyone has migrated mostly to television, and I'm very interested and have worked a bit in episodic stuff, most recently in a horror science fiction Spanish language series on Amazon called Soldados o Zombies. Soldiers or zombies.
That's amazing. That's good stuff. Mask of Zorro came out on Netflix a month or 2 ago, and it was really cool seeing your name in the credits. So I was like, hey, I know that guy.
Well, I can't take credit for it all. Unfortunately, I was the first of 9 screenwriters on that project, and there were I think about 52 drafts of the screenplay.
I believe it.
All I remember is that, standing next to them all, and when they're stacked on top of each other, it was almost up to my eye level.
Yeah. Oh, I believe it. I believe it. It was still really cool seeing your name, and I think it was story by, yeah, absolutely. Well, Randall, I am super excited to learn more about the person you chose that you think deserves like a movie or a miniseries about them. Tell us more.
Well, the guy that I chose he's actually related to the whole Zorro saga in indirect, well, not actually indirect. I mean, pretty direct way. You have to kind of go back and dig down through these various elements. His name was John Rollin Ridge, but that was an anglicized version of his name, which was in the Cherokee language, it was translated into English as Yellowbird. And Yellowbird was the son of his father, John Ridge, who was a very active Cherokee activist in the minority of the tribe, a political group who, in a sense, more or less collaborated with or agreed to with white society. And he was a signatory along with his father, Yellowbird's grandfather. They were signatories to a treaty called, the Treaty of New Echota. It was signed in Georgia back in 1835, late 1835. And what it did is that it ceded a number of large parcel of Cherokee Indian lands to the whites. And this was east of the Mississippi. And roughly, the Cherokee famously were removed from their traditional lands in Georgia, crossed the Mississippi, and pushed out into what was known as Indian Territory, which is out in Oklahoma. This divided the tribe in a lot of ways, because some of them conceded and worked with and became and were assimilated into white society. And so there were these warring factions of all that. Anyway, John Rollin Ridge was born into these circumstances, and at a young age he was a witness to his father murdered by a rival faction of Cherokees who were exacting revenge upon him for being a signer of the treaty.
Got it.
And so this in him was a huge, for a young impressionable boy to actually witness. And this was a very traumatic moment, and it was something that he'd never forgot, carried around for the rest of his life.
Absolutely.
So anyway, what he grew up, led a somewhat checkered life, and ended up out in California, and then became a writer. And so we can talk a little bit about some of the circumstances that led him out there, but it coincided with the California Gold Rush. He himself murdered another Cherokee, who was also one of the assassins who killed his father. So
wow.
This is a really complicated and interesting guy, very well educated. He was sent to boarding schools in Connecticut at first and got a good education because his mother was, white. And I think his family had good connections with the headmaster of this school in some way. So he got a good education. The guy could write, which is very interesting.
Definitely. Yes. So I love this because you have a connection to one of his novels. So tell us a little bit more about one of his novels.
Well, the interesting thing about Ridge is that he is considered by some to be among the first Native Americans, if not the first, with publishing a novel. And it was called The Life and Times of Joaquin Murrayetta, which was published, the Celebrated California Bandit. It was published in 1854. And this was after Ridge had fled to California after murdering one of the supposed conspirators and assassins of his father. He apparently defended himself. He had a good line of defense and saying it was self-defense. Apparently it was an argument over the sale of a horse, but both men knew who they were and where they stood in the tribal politics of things. And
understood, right.
And so underneath it, or the subtext of their argument, so to speak, was probably over the assassination of this father.
Yeah, it had nothing to do with that horse.
Absolutely.
Or whatever they were arguing about. Absolutely. That's like a movie clip in itself.
Oh, totally. I think that happened somewhere in Arkansas, or no, actually in Indian Territory. And then he fled to Missouri and lived there for a short period of time. And then gold was discovered in California.
That makes sense.
In late 1848, but the gold rush really kicked in late 1849 and into 1850, and then off that. Now, I came across him because when I got hired to write The Mask of Zorro, I met with Steven Spielberg to discuss story elements and all of this. It was really more or less an audition, and that's when I went onto the set of Hook, which he was filming at that time.
Right.
So here I am on the stern of Captain Hook's pirate ship, and I'm meeting Robin Williams, and then I'm meeting Dustin Hoffman, and all the. And there's 200 extras in full pirate gear, and we're in the old soundstage in which they shot the Wizard of Oz on the old MGM lot, which was Sony at that time. And so literally in between shots of that Spielberg was directing there, he would yell cut and then turn around and then start talking to me about Zorro. And the conceit was, what he wanted to do was to reimagine the Zorro franchise, and it was a franchise, and he wanted to reimagine it as set during the California Gold Rush. And I love that idea. I responded to it because I'm a big history buff anyway. And I thought, oh,
Yeah.
wow, that's really,
Yeah,
really
you
cool.
are.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so he said, so what do you think? And I said, I think that's really cool. My thoughts, I said, I would love to make Zorro more ethnic, more truly brown skin, mestizo, you know, in the language of the day. And I said, because most likely the Zorro myth or the Zorro character was loosely based on a character known as Joaquin Murrayetta, who was
Yep.
the feared bandit gold in the California gold rush, and who himself may have been a composite character or a composite personality composed of any number of Latino bandits that were plaguing the gold fields, so to speak. There were plenty of Anglo bandits plaguing the gold fields
Right, right.
well.
It was probably an equal opportunity around
Oh
then.
yeah, totally. You know, well, I mean, the interesting thing about the gold rush is that up until that time, it spawned the greatest migration of humanity since the Crusades. So
Oh, wow.
there's even a book about the gold rush, and it's called The World Rushed In, and that's indeed what happened. But so you had every possible ethnicity and nation represented there in the California gold rush in this new state of California, by the way.
Yeah. So it's
Really,
fascinating, right? We have
yeah.
Yellowbird, who wrote a book loosely based off of this character that then ends up being this movie called Mask of Zorro that you did the story for.
Yeah, right. But there were things in between, you know, in the sense because
Yep.
what Joaquin Murrayetta was supposedly captured and killed in a gunfight by a self-appointed California Ranger named Harry Love,
Right.
who was
Right.
basically a racist gangster from out of Texas, who was, like so many people at that time, an opportunist. And
Mm.
he probably, you know, there's no historical evidence that Joaquin Murrayetta was indeed one character. It was almost like the name Joaquin Murrayetta was a kind of a boogeyman, a blanket term for any number
A
of,
number of people
yeah. And you
being a
know,
bandit out there.
they,
Yeah,
there's
that's interesting.
speculation he was from Chile. There's other that he was Mexican. You know, others have said no, he was part of California, the pre-Spanish and Mexican California, you know, pre-American stuff. No
Yeah,
one knows for sure,
yeah.
but Harry Love killed someone, some brown-skinned Latino guy, and cut off his head and put it in a jar of alcohol, and
Oh,
then said,
wow.
this is, and also killed one of his cohort, a guy named Three Fingered Jack, who was
Mm-hmm.
distinctly known for having only 3 fingers on his hand. Cut that
Right.
hand off at the wrist and had that in a jar, and then claimed that he was the killer of Joaquin Murrayetta. He's a hero, and then went out on a lecture circuit with both artifacts in jars.
Oh
And
gosh. Well,
so it
that's
just,
that's horrible and racist. My
oh,
goodness.
or you think, it's just, you know, this guy. And
Oh,
so anyway, when I got the assignment to do this, I started, you know, Spielberg reacted very positively to all these elements. And when I started researching, though, I went up into the California Gold Rush country and did a lot of research and all of this and stuff. And I just knew that Harry Love was just a villainous character, you know, and all that. But anyway, the head disappeared during the California earthquake. It long outlasted Harry Love, but no one knows exactly what happened, but it probably was lost in the earthquake and the subsequent fire in San Francisco in 1906. Anyway, back to John Rollin Ridge, or Yellowbird. By this time, he had come out to California in response to the gold rush. He obviously had heard about Joaquin Murrayetta because he failed as a miner and began working as a newspaperman, and became
mm,
actually the very first editor of the Sacramento Bee newspaper. And when Joaquin or Harry Love claimed to have killed Joaquin and the lecture circuit was going on, I think a lot of this began to register in Rollin Ridge's mind here, that there was a story here. And basically what he saw, or what he did, was turn Joaquin Murrayetta into a Robin Hood like character, robbing the rich and giving to the poor. And he then began to infuse it also with elements of his father, who had been murdered unjustly.
Right, that makes sense. Like that's what you do, bringing a little bit of yourself into your character.
Totally. And he began to work that into the story of Joaquin Murrayetta, novelized, fictionalized, from, fictionalizing an already probably fictional character.
Mm-hmm.
and then rushed the book to get published in 1854. And it was wildly popular, but there's no evidence that Yellowbird Ridge profited from it in any sort of way. I don't know how they published things in those days, but it didn't exactly make him rich.
Wow.
Ultimately.
Wow. I hope his family's getting some residuals.
Well, that's really,
that's my sincere hope.
Yeah.
Right.
He would die young in 1867 from encephalitis in Grass Valley, California. But what's interesting also is that he remained politically very active, and he was what was known as a Copperhead, which was, he was in favor of the Union as the Civil War approached. He was in favor of the Union staying together, but he was sympathetic to the southern states.
Mm-hmm.
And as some people may not know, many of the Cherokee profited and became wealthy landowners, and they were slave owners. And in fact, although many of them fought on the side of the North as well. And in fact,
there's always going to be a mixed bag.
Yeah. And in fact, one of the last Confederate general to surrender in the American Civil War, a full 2 or 3 months after Robert E. Lee, was General Stand Watie, who was a Cherokee chief from the Oklahoma territories. So.
A quick side note, I went to a one-woman show, and it was I believe she was half Cherokee, and that's where I got educated on that the Cherokee also owned slaves, and so she was recounting her kind of going back and understanding her heritage, and she saw some information about her family owning slaves, and she couldn't believe it, and so that was it was this context of theater, so gosh, that's a whole other podcast, like that could be a whole series in and of itself.
It truly is. When you get into what was known as Indian territory out there, it truly was a melting pot of ethnicity, and there was nothing like it. Because all the tribes that had been driven out of their native lands were thrust together in this relatively small area. And, they call them the 5 civilized tribes there originally, but they all spoke different languages. They had different customs. They had, because it was federal territory, federal lands, even though they were sovereign, had their sovereign nations, though this was federal territory. Because they were sovereign nations, they had their own police forces. But then they were forbidden from arresting and taking care of any miscreants who were white. So Indian territory, Indian territory became a haven, a safe harbor for a lot of white outlaws stretching well into the turn of the century. And the only jurisdiction of law and order there were federal marshals out of Fort Smith, Arkansas, who could go in and actually get some of these guys. And that's a whole nother story, because that's Bass Reeves and the black lawmen of those days that spoke a lot of these tribal languages. They understood their sense, their customs of justice and punishment, and it's really, really, really fascinating. But
Yeah,
we'll circle back to John Rollin Ridge. But
yeah,
anyway,
I'm curious, did Yellowbird write other novels?
no, he never wrote another novel, but
Ah,
he wrote a lot of poetry, which was
mm,
which is really
mm-hmm.
interesting. And he wrote a lot of essays and political. I don't know if I would call them screeds, but he continued to write, and then he was an editor.
Wow. Oh, okay. Well, he
And
kind of moved up, right? I mean, that's sometimes a natural transition from writer to editor. So
yeah, yeah.
I'm
So, like I said,
curious.
he was the first editor of the Sacramento Bee newspaper. I don't know how long he
Yeah.
lasted there, but again,
Wow.
he didn't last that long ultimately in life. But
Mm-hmm.
but here was a guy, so very complicated guy. His the
A lot going on.
yeah,
A
a lot
lot
going
going
on
on with
in terms
him.
of all this.
Yeah.
And it's somebody like that I just find really, really fascinating, because I think they reflect what the country was like,
Right. Right.
in that. And there was so much mixed blood. There was so much, I mean, in a sense, violence woven in and out of their lives. But a lot of these guys and women, they were opportunists. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
they
Mm-hmm.
saw a moment and they grabbed it. And I
And they
think
went for it.
in the myth
Yeah.
of Joaquin Murrayetta, he saw an opportunity to vent a lot of the trauma and rage he had about his father's murder. And he put
Absolutely.
it into a story. And instead of killing someone else, he wrote a book
Yeah.
about this kind of someone unjustly
Right.
killed. You know,
Right.
so
And it happened at such a young age to Yellowbird. So like the path and everything
yeah.
that could have happened influencing him. Well, you've recounted so many great things about him, and I can see why we could definitely have a movie right in there about him. Are there other interesting factoids about Yellowbird that you'd want to share?
Well, he was recognized by the Southern delegation of the Cherokee. He was an advocate for a lot of their interests. And I guess right after the Civil War or during it, he was asked to. He never apologized for it. He opposed Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation, by the way. But after the war, he was involved still in being advocates for the Cherokee, and he was trying to get what I think one of the promises that the Southern Cherokee were given by the Northerners is that they would have their own state
Mm-hmm.
after the Civil War was over, and that obviously did not happen. And it could have possibly have been partly due to Stan Waddy being such a holdout at the end of the war.
Mm-hmm.
That put a bad taste in a lot of the northern politicians' minds.
Mm,
And say, no way, you guys are completely unrepentant, and we're not going to do that or whatever. So he was disappointed and bitter about those circumstances. But again, he was out on the West Coast by this
mm-hmm.
point, and so he was doing everything from afar. I'm not sure if he traveled back there and advocated, lobbied to various politicians at that time or not, but he was apparently a prolific letter writer, as most men of letters were at that time,
Right.
and
Right.
all that. But really didn't rise much in fame beyond that. When it was published, he took the Anglo name, but later on it was, The Life and Times of Joaquin Murrayetta by Yellowbird. So
Right.
he
Right.
depending
Yeah.
on what text, he really claimed his Cherokee heritage and was proud of that and stuck to it. So,
Absolutely.
again, another little bit of just sort of, context here, that the Cherokee and a lot of those, what were called the civilized tribes.
Quote unquote. Right. Quote unquote civilized tribes. Yeah.
Yeah, quote unquote civilized tribes. Exactly. Thank you. I forget. This
I
is
know. For those of you on audio, Randall, when he first said it, he put air quotes. So yes, we're on the same page, Randall.
but they pigmentation, their skin. These were woodlands people, and so traditionally, all the way up through like the Miami and the Shawnee and stuff like that, these were forest peoples.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were not the really brown skinned, darker Plains Indian types that we would see later on. I think they got a little bit more that way once they moved further out, and then they were all pushed out into Indian territory. But a lot of them were, it was easier for them than, let's say, the Lakota nations and some of the Plains Indians, the Cherokee and all that, to assimilate with white society. It was easier for them to do that than it was for their brethren who were further out west.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why some of them were accepted and well educated, because they weren't really considered, savages or Indians. Quotes.
Air quotes
Air
again.
quotes
Yep.
again,
Yeah, those horrible terms. Yeah. Yeah.
And so that was different, that and
Mm-hmm.
that caused also these really brutal factions, schisms between traditional tribes, unity.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And this is where it's so important, right? The monolith does not exist. And it is us also knowing more about the true history of many groups in the United States and Canada in regards to the different factions and different political alliances, different ways of life. There's a lot for us to learn and unpack there. So Yellowbird sounds fascinating. I'm actually really looking forward to learning more about Yellowbird and Yellowbird's poetry and alliances and stances.
I will
Fascinating.
I will say that just to draw the ultimate connection then to Zorro, which was that Zorro was a mythic figure, a fictional character created by an Anglo guy named Johnston McCulley.
Mm-hmm.
Johnston McCulley also had been a newspaper man in the early years of the 20th century. And he undoubtedly, and he was in the San Francisco, I think, Los Angeles area, undoubtedly he had come across stories of Joaquin Murrayetta and Yellowbird's novel. And I think then that became the basis for the Zorro character, of a Robin Hood-like character then, because the very first Zorro story, The Curse of Capistrano, was published in 1919, and then that spawned a whole plethora of stories. It really spawned the whole franchise at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Johnston McCulley ultimately died childless in the 1950s, early 60s. And he bestowed the whole franchise to his agent.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And then when his agent passed, he passed on the entire franchise onto his two children.
Mm-hmm.
His last name are Gertz, and they are now the trustees and the managers and the owners of the whole Zorro thing. And in fact, they are now in creating a new Zorro, or should I say Zora, because it is about a female Zorro.
Got it.
It will be a series.
Oh, interesting. Well, hey, you know me and my advocacy. I think some of that money needs to go to Yellowbird's descendants. Just saying. I'm telling you.
It would be difficult to prove unless there is something in his archive, Johnston McCulley's archives, to say that, hey, I love this novel. I'm going to, update it into, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. Well, hey, this is the start, right? This is the start of that conversation.
Yeah. It is interesting. It is interesting. And my final comment just about Yellowbird and the Cherokee and so many people of the time, they were walking contradictions in so many ways. And for us, to look back at them from, 100 plus years, that we have to put them in context. And at the same time, we can't idolize them, and again, one of these terrible pejorative terms that's always used is the noble savage. That was bandied around the turn of the century. But the thing is that the Indian nations fought amongst themselves. They maintained slaves. There were huge schisms amongst them. and yet they allied and fought side by side in different circumstances. These were all dimensional people that produced great statesmen, great warriors, great artists, great women that are forgotten. That
Absolutely.
And to look at them as anything but that is to reduce their humanity. So
100%.
I love the fact that, hey, wow, these were really complicated. There were good guys, there were bad guys, there were a lot of gray area.
Oh, absolutely. Because they're human beings. Imagine that.
Completely.
Exactly. Like we were talking earlier, I do think this would make a fantastic movie. I would love to see Yellowbird's movie. So if you had to pitch Yellowbird's story, what would you say, Randall?
It's tough because it's not overtly a high concept thing. I really see this as almost more of like it would work better as a limited series.
Oh, there we go.
Because there are really dramatic moments in like different segments of his life. You know, the murder of his father, the run-in with the law, and his killing of someone else, fleeing through the California gold rush. It's failing.
Absolutely.
The gold rush, failing as a miner, becoming an editor, a man of letters, and then, you know, in Gold Rush, California, that kind of thing. I think that's the kind of story that you would tell and would weave in and out of all these characters from that time period as well.
Absolutely. There'd be some fascinating characters.
He could have had
I want
an
to see
actual encounter with.
I want to see I want to see Three Finger Jack. That would be amazing. Randall, always a pleasure. This is great. How can folks get a hold of you?
They can reach me via my website, randalljahnson.com, and Johnson is spelled Jahnson. People think I'm Scandinavian, but I'm not.
You're not. I know the story of your last name, so that's great. I'm gonna keep that a secret for right now. Randall, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me on the Inclusive Storytelling Podcast.
Ash, thanks for having me. It was fun. I was just getting warmed up. Let's do it again.
I know. That's how it always is. Thank you so much, Randall. Yeah, absolutely. Fascinating. Hey, maybe we could do a part 2.
Okay. You know, I'm game. Talk to you soon.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thanks again for being here. And again, if you're liking these episodes, feel free to leave a review, download, comment, and share. And always remember, if I can support you in making our media more inclusive, feel free to reach out. I'm a screenwriter, podcast host, and an author, and I'm at theinclusivescreenwriter.com or The Inclusive Screenwriter on Twitter and Instagram.